On the 13th of October 1944, 6 German soldiers and officers were brought out to a firing range and they were then shot by a Soviet firing squad. These men had been accused of horrific crimes inside of a concentration camp established in the Stalingrad pocket. Prisoners were rounded up from the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most barbaric battles in history. They were then sent to the shocking and small Gulag 205, where German guards of the Wehrmacht treated Soviet prisoners horrifically. They would torture, terrorise and execute whenever they could, and those who were sent to the firing range were those who were in charge of the camp. Stalingrad and the battle that surrounded it was one of the most savage in history, and millions were killed or were classed as injured or missing following it. Join us today as we look at the executions of the German soldiers of Stalingrad's concentration camp, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Gulag 205 was a German prisoner of war camp which was established in the area surrounding Stalingrad, and it would become a horrific death camp. It started off as a site which would mostly work as a transition camp, but then the Germans would treat the Soviet prisoners of war here terribly. The Germans fed tiny rations to the prisoners, and when the camp was liberated, it was found that there was no food or water for the inmates. Prisoners of Gulag 205 had to melt snow, which was contaminated with human waste, to get any form of water and hydration, and the camp was overcrowded, and human waste was everywhere, as the toilet facilities were non-existent. There were German guards there who would beat inmates terribly. They would also use their dogs to terrorise the Soviet prisoners. Many also were executed and were shot without a trial, and because of the lack of food, there were accounts of cannibalism. However, the camp would be overrun following the German defeat of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad would end on the 2nd of February 1943, but the camp would be liberated a few days before. Stalingrad was a strategic stronghold for both the Soviets and the Nazis, and whoever controlled the city had access to the oil fields of the Caucasus and also the Volga River. The Soviets would then, following Stalingrad, go on the offensive, and they would push the Germans back heavily, and it is seen as one of the biggest turning points of the Second World War. It would result in the capitulation of the German 6th Army, and this was the first of Hitler's field armies to surrender during World War II. But as mentioned, Gulag 205 would be liberated days before the Germans' surrender, and what the liberators found was sheer horror. But the Soviets would capture 6 men, former guards and officials of the camp. These were Wehrmacht Oberst Rudolf Kerput, his deputy Hauptmann Karl Frichter, and officers Fritz Musenfin, Otto Nader, Richard Seidlitz and Kurt Wohlfahrt. These men worked inside of the concentration camp, and they were considered senior guards. The camp was 10 acres in its size, and it was crammed full of around 3,400 prisoners, and this was 3 times more the capacity of the site. It was very overcrowded, and there was nowhere to send the prisoners once they had been encircled, and supplies failed in the final weeks of the camp, and prisoner rations were nothing and were non-existent. One prisoner stated of the camp that, on about the 25th of November 1942, whilst working on a road which led to the Gumrak, 3 kilometres from the camp, a group of prisoners of about 50 to 60 were levelling and clearing the road. One prisoner, whose name I don't know, collapsed from tiredness and exhaustion and could not work. The guard tried to force the exhausted man to stand and work, but the prisoner could not get up. Then the guard shot the prisoner dead with a submachine gun, and he ordered that he be buried in a ditch at the side of the road. Prisoners inside of the camp were dropping dead of starvation and overwork, and there were many executions that took place. The Red Army would find corpses sprawled all over the site, with signs of cannibalism. There were some Soviet soldiers who were rescued, and they later gave evidence against the German guards about what happened inside of Gulag 205. One said, the guards were allowed to shoot without any warning at prisoners who approached a barbed wire barrier, who tried to jump the queue for food, and at prisoners who tried to have a pee in the wrong place. One POW told his Soviet interrogators, hardly any water or bread was given to the prisoners. The prisoners slept in dugouts without any bedding, jammed tight. The prisoners were never able to rest since they had to sleep standing and sitting. There were no baths in the camp. During my whole time in the camp, about 5 months, I did not wash once. It was also said that, in all cases, the Germans would shoot prisoners without warning at all. In the month of October 1942, I saw up to 30 prisoners shot. They shot people every day for falling behind to and from work, and sometimes for breaking rank. I am unable to give the surnames of prisoners shot by the Germans. Moreover, when we were herded from the Alexieva camp to the area of the Karpovka village, then several prisoners were shot dead by German officers for the fact that when we were working, we were bombarded by Soviet troops and several prisoners took cover. After the firing had stopped, the officers came out of their trench dugouts and shot them on the spot. 3 prisoners were shot dead for taking some tobacco whilst working on a dump. There were ongoing war crimes trials in the Soviet Union of captured Germans, and many people inside of cities such as Leningrad flocked to see these Germans being hanged on gallows, as they would see these people as the worst of the worst, who had inflicted great suffering upon them. A war crimes trial took place regarding the 6 captured Germans, and the less senior officers tried to push the blame for the conditions of the camp towards Kerput and also on the other generals. One guard, Otto Merder, stated, "My service in the Gulag was a great spiritual torment for me. It was dreadful to see the terrible condition of Russian prisoners. I stand before the court at that time when the main culprits responsible for the death of 3,000 Soviet prisoners, Field Marshal Paulus, the Army Chief of Staff, General Schmidt, Lieutenant Colonel Konovsky, and the Army Quartermaster, do not stand before this court. They are not only guilty of the death of Soviet prisoners of war, but have put us on the accused bench." With this he was blaming specifically the generals involved in the Battle of Stalingrad. But because of the crimes of Gulag 205, the 6 German guards and officials who had been captured and worked at the camp were then sentenced to death. Their executions would take place on the 13th of October 1944. They were carried out by a firing squad. This was considered a military execution, and it was preferred to being hanged like a war criminal for members of the German army. The men were led out to a firing range where they were then shot. Little is actually known about the executions, and they could also have been shot inside of an NKVD execution chamber, but the firing squad was probably the way that these men did die, due to their military links. They would have been secured to the stake and then faced their firing squad, who would have been ready and eager to shoot to inflict some sort of reprisal on them. The discovery of Gulag 205 and the Stalingrad concentration camp shocked the Soviets, and they could not believe the brutality of the German guards, who treated the prisoners awfully. What they found was a camp which was known for its execution, torture and beatings on a daily basis, but the German men who worked inside of the camp were led to a firing range and were then shot for their actions towards prisoners who were captured after the Battle of Stalingrad. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.